Thank you, Harriet. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me up for the conference. Appreciate you all giving me an opportunity to share with you some stuff that we're very excited about at Iowa State University. As Harriet said, I'm a professor. I've got a research teaching appointment, and so I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about experiments. But I don't know if you're all aware of this. You're all part of an experiment going on right now. This is the O-grain experiment. We're trying to figure out which is more popular. Honey or hemp. You all have voted, and you clearly are on the left-hand side of this. Okay, that's a bad joke, and I apologize, but I warn you there will be more dad jokes coming. So Harriet and the organizers asked me to talk about the possibility for insects, beneficial insects, to provide services to organic farms. And one of the ones that they were most interested in were insects that might feed on pests, things like soybean aphids, earworms, etc. I'm going to save that for the end, and if there's time, I can get back to that. To make a long story short, we've looked at that, and there is potential for insect predators, parasitoids, etc., to provide you pest suppression. But given the type of diversity that goes on in organic farms and the variety of pests you're up against, it's very hard to generalize to one solution. However, there's potential. And given that we're under some time constraints, I'll save that for the end, and we can talk about that if you have questions. By way of a little bit of introduction, at Iowa State, I was hired to be the soybean entomologist. And when I first got there, we were facing the soybean aphid, which is an invasive pest. I don't know if it's such a pest for those of you in Illinois, but in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and parts of Iowa, pretty severe. And early on, I took a lot of questions from conventional farmers who wanted to know how foliar insecticides and seed treatments might play a role in managing this pest. And we spent a lot of time in the field counting aphids and looking to see how well these products worked. But I know for organic farmers, these aren't necessarily on the table for you all. One thing that we did spend a lot of time, in addition to looking at insecticides, were those natural enemies and how well they suppressed aphids. And again, I can talk more about that at the end. But one of the things that got me most excited while we were out in the field, and that my students were starting to respond to for the first 10 years, was the occurrence of pollinators in soybean fields and corn fields. And over the 15 years that I've been at Iowa State, we were noticing both locally and nationally and internationally concern for the increase in insecticide use that was brought on by this invasive pest and the possible contribution that that insecticide use was having to pollinators in our landscape. And a few years ago, a group of scientists published an article in the journal Science titled Bee Declines Driven by Combined Stress from Parasites, Pesticides, and I highlighted this with italics, lack of flowers. And in the bee world, they jokingly call this the 3 Ps: pests, pesticides, and poor forage. Recognizing that these 3 things, not alone, in combination, often at the same time, are drivers for why we're seeing declines in wild bees and why we're seeing it harder for our honey beekeepers to maintain sustainable populations of their bees. Specifically for honeybees, an organization called the Bee Informed Partnership has been surveying honey beekeepers in the United States. And their website is up here. You can find their annual surveys of beekeepers. And they asked the beekeepers, how many of your bees survive the winter? And for Iowa in 2014, 2015, that was about 60% did not survive the winter. This is acknowledged by beekeepers as unsustainable. Beekeepers acknowledge that, yeah, they lose bees. That's part of beekeeping. But they plan for something like 15% loss. At 60% loss, this is really hard for them to recover from. It costs them money. And it prevents them from maintaining year-to-year sustainable, healthy populations of bees. And the concerns for bees has taken on a federal response. This was 2017. U.S. government recognized the 8th bee to be listed as an endangered species. How many of you knew that there were 7 bees already listed before 2017? Anyone? Yeah, I didn't either. Partly because those 7 bees were all located in Hawaii. And as an ecologist, that's not surprising. Species go extinct on islands frequently, much more frequently than, say, at a continental scale. But this 8th species, the rusty patch bumblebee, was endangered because its range in continental United States had reduced from something like 80% to less than 20% of its initial range. It was originally found around here, parts of Iowa. Now it's at risk for extinction. So while all of this is being accumulated, my lab, as we're doing work with the soybean aphid and pests and thinking about the predators that attack that, we're also asking some questions about whether or not there are bees in corn and soybean fields. Soybean, self-pollinated, bred for self-pollination. Corn, wind-pollinated, doesn't really need, these crops don't need bees, but they are providing resources that bees might be using. And so a group of students several years ago started surveying both these fields and then asking, what does that community look like? And what's remarkable to me, even though we've seen increases in insecticide use and we've seen loss of CRP, we found a remarkably robust community of pollinators in our corn and soybean fields. I'm just going to go through a summary of that data somewhat quickly. In total, we found about 50 species of wild bees. 25% of them are what you might call sweat bees. These are tiny little native bees, all within the genus Dialictus, Lasioglossum. 1 out of every 4 were something like this. About 20% were these halictids, specifically Agripostemon virescens. We found up to about a little over 20% of the bees we found were these robust, what looked like to me, bumblebees, but they're solitary bees, Melissoides, Melissoides bimaculata was the most common one here. And rounding up, about 70% of what we found were syrphid flies. These are adults that feed on flowers and can pollinate some plants, but in the larval stage, they're voracious predators. They're maggots that feed on soft-bodied insects like aphids. So that was pretty remarkable and kind of hopeful that we were finding these in conventional corn and soybean fields. The one thing that was a little disturbing was as we're putting these traps out and we're looking for the bees in corn and soybean fields, we found very few honeybees. And we weren't sure if this was because of the surrounding factors, those stressors that I talked about earlier, or if it was just because there weren't honeybees being kept nearby our fields. So about 5-6 years ago, we started asking some questions about whether honeybees can survive in a landscape like Iowa and what conservation practices we could do to help the pollinator community and what form this should take. And to do that, we reached out to anybody who would fund us. And surprisingly, the Soybean Association, Chekhov did. United Soybean Board was interested in this, both because they want to help. They don't want to be seen as working against our pollinators, but they were also interested if honeybees and other bees were affecting soybean yield. There's some evidence that that could take place. And we hired a postdoc here who's now faculty at the University of Illinois, Adam Dozal, brave man working with honeybees without any gloves or a veil. And Adam, with the help of some of our students, set up this really ambitious project where we put out apiaries of honeybee hives next to commercial soybean fields. So this is an example of one. This is a commercial soybean field. We didn't tell the farmer what to do. We just asked if we could put our hives next to that field. And on a pallet, we brought out 4 independent colonies, and we placed them next to a soybean field, and we tracked how well those bees did. We measured their weight. And weight in a colony, outside of all the equipment and the wood, weight is primarily honey. As bees are foraging, they're bringing back nectar, they're converting it into honey, and as that honey crop is brought in, the weight of the colony increases. So we brought scales out and we measured that over the course of the summer. And you can see here from June until August, the mass on average for all those colonies over a 2-year period, this is 2015, 2016 combined, the mass of those colonies increased. But by August, and in the 2 years, it was almost to the week, that mass stopped gaining, and then it started to decline. And what that means is the honeybees are no longer bringing in enough nectar to meet their needs. They're now consuming whatever honey they had in their hive. And if that happens in August, that's bad news bears for those bees because they have to go from August all the way around to the next spring. And what Adam showed was about 53% of the colony mass in honey was lost by October, when we brought the hives out of the field into our overwintering yard. And if you look at this, it's kind of I think the previous speaker brought up this expression, feast and famine. The same thing's going on here. There's a feast when clover and soybeans are blooming in the early part of the summer, but there's also a famine. And Iowa's landscape, and probably a lot of the Midwest landscape, shares this feature of lacking late summer forage. So what do you do about that? What can you do about that? Well, I have a really smart graduate student. She just graduated, and she saw this data, and she noticed that this time period overlaps with data that was coming in from a group at Michigan State who were looking at plants that were found in prairies and asking how attractive are those native plants to beneficial insects. And they had done several years' worth of work, and they summarized it on a website. If you go to www.nativeplants.msu.edu, you can see just more information that you could ever possibly want about the value of native plants, flowering perennial plants that are in prairies. And they've written this up in peer-reviewed journals. Ashley St. Clair noted that in this figure, where they've organized those plants that were most attractive to natural enemies, things like lady beetles, and bees, things like honeybees, if they organized this by bloom period, you could get a 24-hour, all summer long buffet of flowering resources. And in that period where we were seeing a famine, there were flowers, there were species of flowers that would be available, could be available if they were there in the landscape for the honeybees to use. So Ashley does this really clever experiment. Very simple, elegant, but powerful. She starts with 20 honeybee hives at a farm. Looks like this. It's got soybeans, got corn nearby. And she starts measuring the weight of all of those hives. And sure enough, from July getting into August, they start to lose weight. Almost gave away the punchline. Start to lose weight. We saw this at soybean fields around central Iowa, not surprising. But about mid-August, she takes 10 of those hives and moves them to a prairie, to a large tallgrass prairie about 10, 15 miles away from this farm. And within a week or so, that weight decline stops, and they start regaining weight. Because they have available to them now forage, plants that are flowering, that in the farm landscape, typical for Iowa, doesn't exist. So we call this a prairie rescue effect. And we continue to explore this. But it opened up some questions for us about, well, for this form of agriculture, and I get it, you're all grain farmers, maybe not a lot of beekeepers in here, but it opens up a broader question about where we could practice conservation and production at the same time. Because for Ashley's experiment, she had to go and find a patch of prairie that was set up by some conservationists in land that's not being used from agriculture. Beekeepers aren't going to move their hives from August to September to a prairie. It's too much work for them, and it can be risky for the bees. But is there a way to bring these two things together so that the landscape looks something more like this, where we have small patches of prairie embedded within or adjacent to cropland? And it's this kind of landscape that's been the focus of a large study done by a multidisciplinary team at Iowa State University, several other land-grant universities, now encroaching into Wisconsin, called the STRIPS Project. STRIPS is an acronym for Science-Based Trials of Row Crops with Prairie Strips. I'm going to show you a lot of information. I promise you, if you Google STRIPS, ISU, it's totally safe for work, and you'll find our website and you can get all the information. So the STRIPS project is more than just about honeybees and beneficial insects. It starts with this issue, which is for most of the Iowa landscape, and probably for most of the Midwest landscape, about 7 to 8 months out of the year, we have bare soil. We don't grow perennial crops. We don't have perennial vegetation on the landscape. So we're prone to erosion and nutrient loss. And that's a big deal in Iowa, where we're shown data that we're contributing a lot to the anoxic zone at the base of the Mississippi watershed. So anything that can prevent that soil erosion and that nutrient loss is welcomed, or could be welcomed. So what does that have to do with prairie? Why prairie? Well, unlike corn and soybeans, prairie is perennial. You heard about the Kernza that the Land Institute has generated from the types of plants that are found in a native prairie habitat. So there's ground cover throughout the year once that prairie is established. And you heard yesterday about the deep roots that many of the native plants that were found in prairie have. So going several meters into the soil, unlike our annual cultivated crops. There's Kernza there. But above ground, those stems are staying erect, and they can act as a barrier in a way that's different from other land management practices affecting water flow. So many of you are probably familiar with grass waterways that are put onto a field that has some slope. Grass waterways are designed to lay flat and allow that water to move quickly off of the land so you don't get ponding. Prairie has stiff stems that, if put on the contour, perpendicular to the flow of water, can act as a barrier to that water and to that soil. And within that community, there's co-evolved plants that can persist together. So there's diversity there that is native, and within that native community are co-evolved community of animals, insects, that know how to use those plants. So the first phase of research was done at the Neal Smith Wildlife Refuge, where they allowed us to establish fields with small amounts of prairie embedded within a watershed of crops. And at the base of the watershed, there's a flume here that's going to capture the water coming off of that hillside, off of that watershed. So Matt Helmers and his ag engineering crew, using GIS technology, determined that the water here is all going to funnel through this point, and he can determine the flow rates and soil sedimentation loss by putting a flume there. Now, all of this has been published, and you can find the data on this, but I'm going to show you a visual representation of how this can look when the prairies are embedded into these watersheds. So these are pictures taken after a 5-inch rain event that occurred in an 18-hour period during the summer. I think this was 2015. So this is the treatment that was 100% crop and the sediment loss that came down through that flume. One thing to note about this cropland is, this watershed is planted with no-till. This is a section, one rep that had 100% prairie. Same day, same rain event. And it looks great, but I point out to people, especially to conventional farmers, we can't go back to this. We're not going to go back to 100% prairie in Iowa. Right? But if you took 10% of that watershed and replaced it with prairie, this is what you could see. This is basically a 90% reduction in sediment loss, somewhere an 80 to 85% reduction in nitrogen and phosphorus that's coming off of that field into the watershed. All right. Now, I'm an entomologist. This is all exciting, but what I think is really exciting, call me a geek, my kids do, I'm fine with it, I've gone over it, is how biodiverse that field becomes when the prairie is embedded in it. 2.6 times more insect species. Now, some of those are herbivores, but the majority that we found are natural enemies, things that would attack herbivores, lady beetles, parasitoids, all kinds of critters that are fairly voracious, and 3.5 times more pollinators. And that's not just bees, that's things like Lepidoptera, butterflies, those syrphids that I talked about earlier. So this is exciting. And this is happening right as next door to this prairie is conventional agriculture. Seed treatments, herbicides, everything. And we've published this in PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. You can find this information. This is open access, and it goes into more detail in this article about all the benefits that can occur when this prairie is added to a field. And one thing it points out is there are some costs, of course. You're taking land out of production, but that adjacent land that is still in production doesn't suffer from the prairie being there. There's not encroachment of weeds. We haven't seen evidence that herbivorous insects are leaving the prairie and going into the crop. Now, the next thing I'm going to show you, I don't think has anything to do, well, I shouldn't say this so strongly, but I can say that directly this research at Iowa State did not result in the next thing I'm going to show you. The next thing I'm going to show you is, I think, concurrent efforts by other states to address the issues that the Prairie Strips Project was trying to deal with. So maybe some of you are familiar with the Minnesota Buffer Law that was passed a couple years ago in an effort to reduce the impact of agriculture on the land of 10,000 lakes, water quality. And I think of this in general as top-down influence on farmers. To be crass, the government telling people what to do. Maybe that's too strong, but you get the point, top-down. And I don't have an extension appointment, but because I work a lot in agriculture, I spend a lot of time talking to farmers. And the next slide is some data that represents how I think farmers respond to this sort of top-down approach to agriculture. And what's interesting, so yeah, actually, picture from Iowa. I'm not lying when I said it was data, just very subjective data. But the point of this is, that's a take on top-down. Prairie Strips is more of a bottom-up. We did the research. We shared it with farmers, with ag organizations, and we just brought people out to see what we were doing. And from that sharing, we got farmers who said, I want that. I want to do that. Tell me how to do that. That's interesting to me. So this is more of a bottom-up approach. You know, share what you know and see if that can work for you. And this next data slide shows you what I think is the response of farmers to a bottom-up approach to farm management. So these are some farmers early on who came to those meetings and said, yeah, I want to try that. And so we entered into what we call phase 2, the research and demonstration point of strips on commercial farms. As of this year, we have 65 farmers, both in Iowa, some in Wisconsin, some in Minnesota, few in Missouri, who have adopted this practice and fit it to their own needs. I'll show you one example. This is Gary Guthrie's farm, not too far from campus. Gary seeded prairie in 2014 in November in a patch of his farmland where he already had a grass waterway. So that's the yellow line here, and then he ran some parallel prairie strips perpendicular to the contour of the field. And about a year later, he went out after a 2-inch rain event and took some mason jars and was capturing water coming off different parts of his field. This is what it looks like. This is water from the field that was second year in corn stover, deeply tilled. This is water that was coming off that grass waterway. And again, that's what the waterway is designed to do. It's designed to pull that water off, and it's bringing some sediment with it. This is water that he collected on the other side of a prairie strip. I love this slide because this is, was it Adam Davis or one of the other speakers yesterday talked about, well, what could you do? Do your own experiments. This is, in a way, Gary doing his own experiment, trying to replicate, see if the prairie strips and his farm was doing what we had seen in our first phase. I'll show you some other pictures here of what some other farmers have done when they've seen our research and tried to adopt it for their own fields. This is kind of stereotypical, 10% of the land of the watershed put into strips moving up the contour. Here's one where along a body of water, a farmer has done that and a little bit further in. And as those strips mature, and it takes about 3 years for the above ground biomass to pick up and start looking something like this, where you start to see the flowers. And around this point, in 2016, I had another graduate student who was helping out with Ashley and Adam, and he said, all right, I get it. I could see this prairie rescue effect working, but it's asking a lot of a beekeeper to move hives around. This prairie strip site looks like it's got the best of both worlds. What about putting some hives out in these fields and see what happens? And Ge Zhang did just that. In his first year, he scrounged together enough hives to find 2 per location, and he got a couple of locations with and without prairie strips. And he put them out starting in late May, early June, and he tracked their health throughout the summer. And there's Ge. In 2018 and 2019, we had resources from USDA and some matches from industry to expand upon this so you could build up to 4 colonies per location with multiple replications within a year. And he compared those hives to strips versus control sites. And the control sites were identified as being near a prairie strip location, near a prairie strip location, growing the same crop, but without prairie within about a 3-mile radius of the hive. And these are pictures taken in August of this last year, and he wants us to notice the difference. This is at a prairie strip site. There's every colony, each one of these columns represents a unique colony. Every one of those has 4 boxes, right, that the bees live in and store their honey and all. This is a control site, and note that they only have 3. One of those boxes, when filled with honey, is about 45 kilograms. I think that's right. I'm trying to do the math of kilos to pounds. So that's quite a bit of honey. Along the way, we also had another graduate student, Caroline Murray, who was going out and assessing the flowers that were in these control sites, or I'm sorry, in the prairie strip sites and the control sites, also trying to identify the wild bees that might be there, and because she was spending so much time out there, taking track of monarchs. So she's walking along the transect, counting the flowers, and then looking to see, using techniques developed by monarchologists, where the butterfly's at. And what she found, I think, is kind of interesting. I'll show you Ge's results in a second, but hers, I think, are kind of cool, because what she found was that there were more flowers in the prairie strip sites, farms with prairie strips, and that's kind of what my teenage daughter says, no duh. You planted those flowers, what were you expecting? They wouldn't be there? So, okay. But there were fewer milkweed plants at the prairie strip sites than the control sites. And in some ways, this was surprising because milkweed were in that seed mix. But compared to a site where the farmer didn't plant anything, he just sort of manages it for weeds and trying to establish grass, if that, about an order of magnitude more milkweed at the control sites than the prairie strip sites. But when it came to monarchs, no difference. And one of the reasons we think that is monarchs need more than just milkweed to go from egg to butterfly, or to adult butterfly. They also need food for the adult butterflies to feed on, especially late in the year when they're heading back down to Mexico. And prairie strips have a lot of flowers to provide them with that resource. So that's great if you have a passion for monarch butterflies, if you have a passion for flowers. But if you're practicing agriculture and you're interested in what production can come out of this field, Ge's data, I think, is very interesting. I'm going to show you this by year. He's got 3 years worth of data here. And this is the weight of the hives. The prairie strip sites are in red, the controls are in blue. In 2017, what is that, about a 20 kilo difference between the 2 sites? In 2018, not as good difference, but we're still seeing statistically significant weight gain in the prairie strip sites than the controls. 2019, this last year, was our best year. By the end of the summer, or at least by the end of the experiment, we had 26% greater honey production in the hives that were kept at a prairie strip site than one that wasn't. And when Ge did the math on this, when it came down to how much money would that be for a beekeeper, with the rate that honey was going, I think it was about $5 per pound, we're looking at about $113 more per colony at a location than at a control site. This next slide I'm going to show you, I had nothing to do with other than I was in the audience. This last summer, we asked some of the landowners who are practicing, who have put prairie strips at their location, to share with the public their experience. And we went out and did a field day. And the landowner, when it came his turn to talk to the group, the first thing he did was hold up this bottle. And it's what some beekeepers call a honey payment. Because what had happened is when the local beekeepers found out that he was putting in prairie strips at his farm, they went to him and said, would it be all right if we put our bees there? And he's like, yeah, sure, go for it. You know. And at the end of the summer nectar flow, when he came out, the beekeeper gave him this jar. And I think he actually gave him more than just this, but this was what he held up. And he's like, look, I'm going to paraphrase what he said. He said, look, I didn't get into this to practice beekeeping. You know, he wanted to add some diversity to his farm, but he was pleasantly surprised when he could visually see the productivity that occurs when we add that biodiversity back into our farm. So this is what his prairie strips look like, and this is that productivity in his hand. Okay, so some take-home points from this. Honeybees, wild bees persist in our landscape in Iowa, both in the crop. There's a decline in forage starting in August, and prairie, those native plants, can provide that forage both for pollinators but also for other beneficial insects like predators. That could spill over into your adjacent crop and provide yet another ecosystem service. How am I doing on time? 20 minutes. I don't know if they want that. They're probably, they're probably wondering, God, can this guy talk? I tell my wife I'm a recovering extrovert. So I've got a little bit more, and I'm about to transition, and I want to warn you, I've been told that there are two ways to kill a conversation, two things you can talk about to kill a conversation: religion and politics. I'm going to talk about one of those. Yeah. The question was, did we measure an impact on soybean yield? We tried. When that first experiment that I showed you with Adam's work, we tried. One problem we had was, while we were trying to measure the impact of pollinators on the soybeans, those fields were also being infested by soybean aphids. So we found it difficult to remove that confounding effect. And we started using cages where we would cage the plant to prevent the bees from visiting. Unfortunately, in that experiment, the aphids found a way to get in. And so we made a happy little home for the aphids, and whatever benefit that might have been occurring between the cage, that we could have seen between the cage and uncaged, we think it was completely removed by them being infested with aphids. So it's hard. There's evidence in the literature, especially out of Brazil and the south of the United States, that when you bring honeybees next to a soybean field, you can see a bump in yield. But trying to replicate that in this part of the world is a little bit challenging. And I've had a lot of farmers come up to me aware of that data, aware of that research, and ask, how would I do this? And I said, well, or one, is it real? Is this true? And then how would I do this? And I said, well, given what I've read, it looks like it could be real. The problem is, how do you manage, what's the recommendation to deliver that service? How many honeybees do you bring out? How long do you keep them there for? What's the stocking rate? Is this a variety by variety variation, you know, in terms of how the plants respond to bees? Some work's being done by a colleague of mine in Mississippi, Catherine Paris, and she had 1/8 of an acre cages that she grew soybeans in and had it replicated both with and without honeybees. And she found for a range of varieties, there were a few that responded positively, but they are maturity groups that we probably, I don't know if we would grow up here, like 4.1s, 4.2s. Yeah. No,
oh, okay, thank you. Interesting thing that happened to us, we were doing a farmer-producer study, so we put 5 acres into pollinator habitat next to a soybean field. And our levels of aphids went to 250, you know, you're starting to panic about then. and then it stayed, and then it started to come down because of all the lace wings and all the predators for the aphids that naturally were occurring. In the adjacent field, we didn't have pollinator habitat, went to 5,000 counts of aphids, which is devastating to a farm. Yields were cut by half. One of the interesting things that we saw in the soybean field is that we were really working hard on leaf cutter bees to establish that. And we saw this circular,
Like a hole punch.
yes, like a hole punch.
Like a teenage kid went out and just I'm going to clip little pieces of a leaf, yeah?
in the soybean field. And we thought, well, let's see what happens. And what happened repeatedly, well, it was only twice, but the soybeans were the highest in protein we had ever grown, because we think that the stress on the soybeans, or there was something that they interpreted that the protein, same seed in adjacent field, was not that high, same fertility. So we really think that there was something to it. So it's just a, off-cuff kind of a comment, but it's something that no one's looking at this point. And we worked really hard to establish native bees in there too, because it seems like the native bees compete with the honeybees, and they both have to work harder. And the honeybees being lazier, the natural bees are already out there working. So it's just kind of an off-cuff.
Don't disagree with anything you said. That's great. The one thing I would say is we are trying to answer some of those questions about how bees respond to pollinators. But it's remarkable how little is known. And I've heard from breeders who have said, yeah, we think something's going on, but they often work against this. They don't want cross-pollination to occur. They want to develop pure lines, without the contamination. Yeah, it's a hard issue to address, because we have insects that are both working against yield, but maybe also working for yield. One more, I don't know if these are questions that you're trying to avoid me to talk about politics, or, but I'm coming from a state, we're the first in the nation, and I've got a lot of politics to talk about. But go ahead, I'll take your call.
Charles Martin from Illinois. I worked with mason bees who drill holes in fence posts. Did you ever think about setting up habitat, like drilling holes in fence posts and along fence?
So a little bit of history. Back in 2014, one of the previous administrations issued a presidential memorandum. This is like an executive order. Trying to address this national issue, decline in wild bees and honeybees. So title of it was Creating a Federal Strategy to Promote the Health of Honeybees and Other Pollinators. That was the previous administration. All right. This is a picture not far from my home, leading up to the last presidential election. I'm a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but there's a point here that relates to pollinators. I don't mean to rile anybody up, but this was, I think, somebody who was not in support of the previous administration. Is that fair to say? And this is right before the election. This is the same neighbor, same sign, about a month after the election. So what am I trying to get at? Don't ever talk about religion and politics. It's divisive, right? Except there are some things that unite us. And I think this is one of them. I think this is somewhat universal. And we've done surveys of farmers and the public, and the willingness to pay for prairie strips, for all the benefits, pollinators is at the top. It's not to say that the public isn't willing to pay for services like clean water and soil health and prevention of erosion, but pollinators, when we ask would you most willing to pay, pollinators is at the top. And I think our representatives, our politicians, et cetera, are starting to hear that, because starting in 2018, prairie strips was added to CRP. It was in the Farm Bill. So this seems to be something that, even though there has been differences between parties and administrations, this is one where there's some common ground. And starting this year, through CRP, you can participate in prairie strips by joining in for that activity. And I'll leave this up here. This just came out in December. So in the Farm Bill, it says prairie strips. And then the bureaucrats are like, well, what does that mean? So over the last year, the fact sheets and the rules for participating in prairie strips through CRP, if you want that payment, have been worked out. Excuse me. You can find information on this at this website. This is a PDF. It'll explain some of the basics. And then in the handouts that Harriet and Jody, is it, that she were, there's a couple handouts in the back of the room that are some frequently asked questions by farmers and landowners about how would you get this started. It's not trivial. Finding seed, preparing the land, getting the prairie established, et cetera. And then some questions about what it means to farm next to prairie. Those are answered in those handouts in the back of the room. Did I answer your question, sir? Thank you. Yeah, another question?
Yeah, we've got organic seed corn. We're constantly turning all the time with detasselers and this and that, so we quit doing end rows. It's just a waste. So is there something we could plant out there? I talked to the FSA people about their pollinator program, but they don't want you turning on it. You can't be driving on it, they said, to qualify. And I just wonder if there's something else we could plant under our pivot irrigation systems where we park them, and these end rows all around the farm fields, just like permanent. I thought of white clover or something. Is there something else we could plant that would be of some benefit to something else?
So, yes, the answer is yes. And I would encourage you to go to this website, the Native Plants at MSU. They have lists, fact sheets for, I think it's up to 80 plants now, that have been shown to be attractive to natural enemies and bees. And they also account for herbivores. All right? So what they're trying to find is that sweet spot of something that's attractive to the good insects and not to the bad. And they describe the planting, conditions that would be ideal for these. They recently updated the website, and they've included plants that can survive in drier conditions, anticipating climate change, anticipating changes in rainfall, and thinking about, okay, some of these can persist very well in our current climate, will be others that would maybe be better suited for something that's in a drier condition. I don't know if I'm actually answering your specific question, but I think what I'm trying to tell you is you may have to do some homework to fit the unique conditions of your farm. And this is a site that it can help you do that homework.
We're looking for something that will survive the tractor time.
So some of these emerge above ground later in the year than earlier. Some flower early and then go through senescence a little bit later. Off the top of my head, I'm up here talking to 100 people. I'm a little bit nervous. I can't give you a specific one, but that kind of information could be available at this website.
So let's say thank you to Matt. Are you going to be around?
I'll be around, yeah. And like I said, Recovering Extrovert would be happy to talk more about this. I will want to plug just one thing, our website for prairie strips. If you have more questions, and especially ones that I can answer, please visit our website. Maybe think about inviting Lisa Schulte-Moore or Tim Youngquist, our guy when it comes to working directly with farmers on this. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.